You've probably heard it before. We were happy. Everything was fine. I don't understand why it happened. And maybe that's the part that hurts the most, the confusion. Because cheating is easier to process when something is clearly broken. But when it happens inside something that felt safe, warm, even loving, it leaves you questioning everything. And if you've ever been involved with someone who leans fearful avoidant, the answer isn't as simple as betrayal or lack of love. It's deeper, it's quieter, and honestly, it's far more unsettling, because in many of these cases, the relationship wasn't fake, the love wasn't fake, the connection wasn't fake, but underneath all of that, there was something else happening, something internal, something they often didn't even have the words for. You see, a fearful avoidant doesn't just experience love the way most people do. Love doesn't just feel like comfort, it also feels like exposure, like risk, like standing too close to something that could hurt them deeply. So even when everything looks happy on the outside, there can be a storm building that no one else sees, and that storm doesn't always show up as arguments or distance at first. Sometimes it shows up as restlessness, as subtle disconnection, as a quiet urge to pull away without knowing why. And when that internal pressure builds long enough, some people don't walk away. They escape in ways that hurt both themselves and the person they care about. Here's where it gets complicated. Fearful avoidants don't just fear abandonment, they also fear closeness. So when a relationship starts becoming stable, consistent, emotionally safe, something unexpected happens. Instead of relaxing into it, their nervous system can actually start to panic. Because deep down, safety feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar feels unsafe. So even though they may consciously think, this is what I've always wanted, their body is sending a completely different message. It's saying, this is too much, this is dangerous, you're about to lose yourself. And that internal contradiction is exhausting. Imagine loving someone, wanting them, enjoying your time together, and at the exact same time, feeling an unexplainable urge to create distance. Not because of anything your partner did, but because closeness itself is triggering something unresolved inside you. That tension doesn't just disappear. It builds, slowly, quietly, until it needs an outlet. And for some fearful avoidants, instead of confronting that discomfort or communicating it, they look for relief. Not necessarily because they want someone else, but because they need to feel less trapped in their own emotions. Cheating, in this context, becomes less about desire and more about escape. Escape from intensity, escape from vulnerability, escape from the fear of being fully seen. And what makes this even harder to understand is that in many cases, they don't plan it. It's not some calculated decision where they wake up and choose to betray someone they care about. It often starts small. A conversation that feels light and easy, an interaction where there's no emotional weight, no expectations, no pressure to be deeply known, and that contrast feels relieving. Because in their main relationship, everything matters. Every word, every emotion, every moment carries significance. But outside of it, things feel simpler, less intense, less exposing. That's where the danger begins. Because instead of recognizing that what they're actually craving is emotional regulation, they misinterpret it as connection with someone new. And slowly, that line gets crossed. Not always physically at first, sometimes emotionally. Sometimes it's just sharing parts of themselves they've been struggling to express with their partner. And that alone can create a sense of distance from the relationship they're actually in. And here's the painful truth. It's not that their partner wasn't enough. It's that the closeness itself became overwhelming. So instead of leaning in and working through it, they split their emotional world in two. One side where everything feels deep, real, and intense, and another side where everything feels easy and detached. And in that split, they lose alignment with themselves. After it happens, that's when the internal conflict becomes even louder. Because now, it's not just about fear of closeness, it's also about guilt. And fearful avoidants don't process guilt in a straightforward way. Guilt for them can feel just as overwhelming as vulnerability. It threatens their self-image. It forces them to confront parts of themselves they've been trying to avoid. So instead of immediately taking responsibility, many shut down. They withdraw. They become distant, not just because they don't care, but because they don't know how to face what they've done without completely unraveling. And this is where it becomes deeply confusing for the person on the other side, because you might expect remorse to look like openness, honesty, effort, but instead you're met with silence, avoidance, or emotional detachment. And it feels like proof that the relationship didn't matter, but in reality it's often the opposite. The more it mattered, the harder it is for them to face the damage they caused. So they create even more distance, hoping to escape the consequences of their own actions. And this only deepens the wound for both people involved, because now it's not just about betrayal, it's about disconnection layered on top of it. And maybe the hardest part to accept is this: their behavior isn't always a reflection of how much they loved you. It's a reflection of how much they struggle with love itself. That doesn't excuse it, it doesn't make it okay, but it explains why something that looked happy could still fall apart in such a painful way. Fearful avoidants often carry a deep belief that love doesn't last, that closeness leads to pain, that if someone truly sees them, they'll eventually leave. So when things actually start going well, when the relationship feels stable and real, it challenges everything they've learned to expect. And instead of trusting it, they unconsciously test it, they disrupt it. They create the very outcome they fear, just to regain a sense of control. Because losing something by your own actions can feel less terrifying than losing it unexpectedly. And that's the quiet tragedy in all of this. They don't just hurt the person they're with, they sabotage the one thing they've always wanted: a real, safe, lasting connection. And unless they become aware of this pattern, unless they learn how to sit with intimacy instead of running from it, the cycle repeats. Connection, fear, escape, regret, over and over again. And if you've been on the receiving end of this, it's important to understand something clearly. You weren't too much, and you weren't not enough. You were simply loving someone who didn't yet know how to stay when things started to feel real. And if you're still sitting with the aftermath of this, trying to make sense of it, there's a question that keeps looping in your mind. If it was real, why risk losing it? That question doesn't come from logic, it comes from pain. Because when something feels genuine, you expect it to be protected. You expect effort, honesty, and care to naturally follow. But with fearful avoidance, the moment something becomes real is often the exact moment their internal alarm system starts going off. Not because you did something wrong, but because reality feels permanent. And permanence, to them, feels dangerous. So instead of protecting the relationship, they start protecting themselves from the relationship. That might sound confusing, but it shows up in subtle ways at first. They may start overthinking interactions, feeling irritated by things that never bothered them before, or questioning their feelings without any clear reason. It's not because their love suddenly disappeared, it's because their fear got louder. And when that fear isn't understood, it starts to look like self-sabotage. Because deep down, they're not just afraid of losing you, they're afraid of losing control over themselves. And cheating, as destructive as it is, can feel like a twisted way to regain that control. It creates distance instantly. It disrupts the closeness that was starting to feel overwhelming. And for a brief moment, it gives them relief from the emotional intensity they didn't know how to handle. But that relief doesn't last. In fact, it usually makes everything worse. Because now, instead of just dealing with fear, they're also dealing with shame. And shame is something fearful avoidants struggle with deeply. It reinforces the belief that something is wrong with them, that they're incapable of maintaining something healthy, that they'll always ruin good things. So instead of opening up and trying to repair the damage, they often retreat even further into themselves. And from the outside, it can feel like they've completely shut you out. Like the person who once cared, who once showed up, who once made you feel seen, is suddenly gone. And that shift is what breaks people the most. Not just the cheating itself, but the emotional disappearance that follows. Because now you're left trying to process two losses at once: the betrayal and the person you thought you knew. And here's the part that's hard to accept. Their withdrawal isn't always because they don't care. It's because caring feels unbearable in that moment. Facing you means facing what they did, facing what they risked losing, facing the possibility that they've become the very thing they feared. So instead they avoid, not just you, but the truth. And that avoidance keeps the cycle alive. At this point, many people start turning inward, questioning themselves. Was I too available? Did I love too deeply? Did I miss the signs? And while reflection can be healthy, there's a dangerous line where it turns into self-blame. Because the reality is, you can't love someone into emotional stability if they haven't built it within themselves. You can show up consistently, communicate clearly, create safety, and it still won't stop someone from running, if closeness itself is what they fear. That's the part people struggle to accept, because it challenges the idea that love alone is enough. With fearful avoidance, love is only one piece of the equation. Without self-awareness, without emotional regulation, without the ability to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it, even the healthiest relationship can feel overwhelming to them. And that doesn't make the relationship weak. It means the internal foundation isn't stable yet. So if you're replaying everything, trying to figure out what you could have done differently, understand this: you weren't responsible for managing their internal conflict. You were responding to what was in front of you. And if what was in front of you looked like love, consistency, and connection, then it makes sense that you trusted it. The confusion you feel now isn't because you were blind. It's because what you experienced was real but incomplete. Now here's where the deeper truth starts to emerge. Patterns like this don't just disappear on their own. If a fearful avoidant doesn't become aware of what's driving their behavior, they often carry it into the next relationship. And at first, everything feels different. New connection, new energy, new excitement. It feels like a fresh start. But over time, the same cycle begins to unfold. The closeness builds, the fear activates, the internal pressure rises. And once again, they're faced with a choice they don't fully understand: lean into the discomfort or escape it. And without growth, escape usually wins. That's why it's so important not to romanticize what happened or wait for them to suddenly change without doing the internal work. Because change, real change, requires more than regret. It requires accountability. It requires facing the parts of themselves they've been avoiding. It requires learning how to stay present when everything inside them is telling them to run. And that's not something anyone else can do for them. No amount of patience, understanding, or love from you can replace that process. And that's where your power comes back into the picture, not in fixing them, not in waiting for them, but in choosing what you accept moving forward. And maybe this is the part you need to hear the most. Closure doesn't always come from them explaining why they did what they did. Sometimes closure comes from understanding the pattern, seeing it clearly, and deciding not to carry it with you anymore. Because if you hold on to the belief that their actions were a reflection of your worth, you'll stay stuck in a loop that was never yours to begin with. Their inability to handle closeness doesn't define your capacity to love. Their escape doesn't erase what you gave, and their confusion doesn't mean the relationship was meaningless. It means it was real, but they weren't ready to sustain it. And that distinction matters more than you think, because one keeps you questioning yourself and the other allows you to move forward with clarity. You don't have to shrink your love to make someone else comfortable. You don't have to become less expressive, less present, less emotionally available just to avoid being hurt again. What you need isn't less love, it's someone who knows how to stay when love becomes real. Someone who doesn't confuse safety with danger. Someone who doesn't run when things deepen. And until then, the most important thing you can do is not abandon yourself trying to understand someone who couldn't stay present with you. Because healing doesn't come from figuring them out, it comes from choosing yourself, fully, without hesitation, even after everything that tried to make you question your worth. And even after you reach that point of understanding, there's still something that lingers, the emotional imprint they left behind. Because relationships like this don't just end cleanly, they stay with you in quiet moments, in the way you second guess yourself, in the hesitation you feel when something new starts to look real again. You might notice it in the way you hold back now, just a little. Not because you've stopped loving deeply, but because a part of you remembers what happened the last time you did, and that's the hidden cost of being involved with someone who couldn't hold emotional consistency. It doesn't just break your trust in them, it starts to shake your trust in your own judgment. You begin to wonder how something that felt so genuine could shift so drastically, and that confusion can slowly turn into self-protection. You might tell yourself you'll be more careful next time, more guarded, less open, but here's the quiet truth. The part of you that loved fully wasn't the problem. That part of you is actually your strength. The goal isn't to shut that down, it's to pair it with awareness, because now you can recognize the difference between someone who is emotionally available and someone who only appears that way until things get real. There's also something else that doesn't get talked about enough. The way fearful avoidance can leave emotional doors half open, not fully committed, not fully gone, and that ambiguity can keep you stuck longer than the relationship itself. Maybe they reach out occasionally, maybe they give you just enough to keep the connection alive, but never enough to rebuild trust. And that creates a different kind of pain, one that's harder to walk away from because it never feels completely over. But that pattern isn't accidental. It often comes from the same internal conflict, the desire for connection mixed with the fear of it. So they hover, close enough to feel something, but distant enough to avoid responsibility. And if you're not careful, you can get pulled into that space, hoping that this time will be different, hoping that the version of them you experienced at the beginning will come back. But real change doesn't come from moments, it comes from consistency. And if consistency isn't there, then what you're holding on to isn't potential, it's a pattern. And patterns don't change unless something deeper shifts within them. At some point, the focus has to shift, not toward what they're doing, not toward what they're feeling, but toward what you need to heal. Because healing from this kind of experience isn't just about moving on, it's about rebuilding your internal sense of safety. It's about learning to trust your emotions again without letting fear take over your decisions. And that process isn't instant. There will be days where you feel strong, clear, ready to move forward, and then there will be moments where everything comes rushing back. The memories, the questions, the what-ifs. And instead of fighting those moments, it's important to understand them. They're not signs that you're stuck, they're signs that something meaningful happened and your mind is trying to make sense of it. But over time, as you keep choosing yourself, those moments start to lose their intensity. The emotional charge fades, the confusion clears. And what's left is clarity. Not about why they did what they did, but about what you deserve moving forward. And that clarity becomes your foundation. It helps you recognize red flags earlier. It helps you set boundaries without guilt. And most importantly, it helps you walk away from anything that feels inconsistent with the kind of connection you're ready for now. And when you reach that place, something shifts inside you. You stop trying to decode mixed signals. You stop chasing emotional availability that comes and goes. You stop convincing yourself to stay in situations that feel unstable just because there are moments of connection. Because you've experienced what inconsistency feels like, and you know it's not something you want to build your future on. This doesn't make you cold, it doesn't make you distant, it makes you clear about your standards, clear about your boundaries, clear about the kind of love you're willing to accept. And that clarity changes the way you show up. You become more intentional, more grounded, less reactive to emotional highs and lows. And ironically, this is the kind of energy that attracts healthier connections. Because you're no longer operating from a place of trying to prove your worth, you're operating from a place of knowing it. And that shift is powerful. It turns your past pain into something that guides you instead of something that controls you. So if you've been trying to understand why something that felt happy could still end in betrayal, here's what it comes down to. Sometimes the biggest battles in a relationship aren't happening between two people, they're happening within one of them. And if that internal battle isn't faced, it will eventually spill into the relationship, no matter how good it looks on the surface. That doesn't mean love wasn't there, it means stability wasn't. And without stability, even real feelings can't hold something together long term. But your story doesn't end there. You don't carry their patterns forward, you learn from them. You don't shrink your capacity to love, you refine where you invest it. And you don't let one experience define your future, you use it to build something stronger, more aligned, and more secure. Because the kind of connection you're looking for, the one that feels safe, consistent, and real, it doesn't require you to question yourself at every step, it doesn't leave you confused about where you stand, and it doesn't disappear when things start to deepen, it stays, it grows, it holds, and when you finally experience that, you'll realize something important. It was never about finding someone perfect, it was about finding someone who knows how to stay present when love stops being easy and starts becoming real. And just when you think you've reached clarity, there's often one last layer that surfaces, the part of you that still wonders if they'll come back and finally get it. Not just return, but return changed, more aware, more stable, more capable of holding what they once couldn't. And that hope, it's not foolish. It comes from the fact that you saw something real in them. You experienced moments where they were present, open, even deeply connected. So your mind holds on to those moments as proof of what's possible. But here's the reality that's hard to sit with. Potential isn't the same as consistency. Someone can show you glimpses of who they could be without having the capacity to sustain it. And if you base your decisions on those glimpses instead of their patterns, you end up waiting for a version of them that only shows up temporarily. That's how people get stuck. Not because they don't see the truth, but because they've seen enough good to question it. And breaking out of that loop means choosing to believe what someone shows you consistently, not occasionally. It means recognizing that real change isn't emotional, it's behavioral. It shows up in actions, in accountability, in the way someone handles discomfort instead of escaping it. There's also a deeper emotional thread that often goes unnoticed, the attachment to the intensity itself, because relationships with fearful avoidance can feel incredibly powerful. The highs are high. The connection, when it's there, feels deep and almost irreplaceable. And when that intensity is suddenly taken away, it leaves a kind of emotional withdrawal. You don't just miss the person, you miss the feeling. The anticipation, the emotional depth, the sense of something meaningful unfolding. And without realizing it, that intensity can become addictive. So even when you know the pattern isn't healthy, a part of you still craves it. That's why moving on can feel so difficult, even when you understand what happened logically, because your nervous system got used to that rhythm of closeness and distance, and now calmness might feel unfamiliar, even boring. But here's the shift that changes everything. Learning to see stability not as a lack of passion, but as a foundation for something deeper. Because real connection isn't built on emotional highs and lows. It's built on consistency, safety, and mutual effort. And once you experience that, the chaos you once mistook for depth starts to lose its appeal. As you continue to heal, you may start noticing something else. Your standards begin to change. Not in a rigid or defensive way, but in a grounded, self-respecting way. You start paying attention to how people show up over time, not just how they make you feel in the moment. You become more aware of emotional availability, of accountability, of whether someone can sit in discomfort without running from it. And this awareness doesn't come from fear, it comes from experience. You've already seen what happens when those things are missing. So now you're not just looking for connection, you're looking for alignment. And that shift protects you in ways you didn't have before. It helps you step back earlier when something feels off. It helps you trust your instincts instead of overriding them. And most importantly, it helps you choose relationships that feel stable, not just exciting. Because excitement fades if it isn't supported by something deeper. But stability, that's what allows connection to grow, to evolve, to last. And once you understand that, you stop chasing intensity, and start choosing consistency. And there's one more truth that deserves to be said clearly. Forgiveness doesn't mean reconnection. You can understand why someone acted the way they did without inviting them back into your life. You can have compassion for their struggles without sacrificing your own well-being. Because forgiveness in its healthiest form is about releasing the emotional hold the situation has on you. It's about letting go of the constant replay, the need for answers, the weight of unresolved feelings. But that doesn't mean you ignore what happened. It doesn't mean you pretend it didn't affect you. It means you acknowledge it fully and still choose yourself. And that choice is powerful. It breaks the cycle. It shifts the focus from them to you, from what they did to what you need. And in that shift, something begins to settle inside you. The questions lose their urgency, the pain loses its intensity, and what remains is a sense of clarity that doesn't depend on their actions anymore. So when you look back on everything, the confusion, the connection, the betrayal, the healing, you start to see the full picture, not just what was lost, but what was learned, not just how it ended, but how it changed you. Because experiences like this don't just leave scars, they also leave insight. They teach you what emotional inconsistency feels like. They show you the difference between someone who wants love and someone who knows how to sustain it. And they remind you in a very real way that your ability to love deeply is not a weakness, it's something to protect and invest wisely. So moving forward, you're not starting from scratch. You're starting from awareness, from strength, from a deeper understanding of what you need and what you're no longer willing to accept. And that changes everything. Because the next time something real begins to form, you won't just be hoping it lasts, you'll be able to recognize whether it has the foundation to. And that's the difference between repeating a cycle and finally breaking it.